June 1942. In the cold concrete basement beneath Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, the morning air hung heavy with the metallic smell of old wiring and overheated radios, as if the very walls were sweating from weeks without rest. Rows of humming decrypting machines filled the room with a constant grinding pulse, and in the middle of the dim-lit maze sat Lieutenant Mark Ellery, a thin, exhausted man in his early 30s whose eyes had forgotten sleep. His uniform clung to him in creases, his fingers stained with ink and coffee, yet his gaze remained fixed on the latest intercepted fragments of Japanese code scattered across the desk like pieces of a cursed puzzle. He had been buried here for 19 days, listening to static, whispers, and half-sentences from across the Pacific. He knew the rhythms of the Japanese naval cipher better than he knew his own heartbeat. And this morning, as the basement vibrated with the slow rumble of decoding engines, he sensed something different, a disturbing pattern sliding beneath the noise. Ellery leaned closer, tracing the coded groups with a trembling pencil. He had seen large operations before, the buildup before Coral Sea, the sudden bursts of encrypted chatter before raids. But this was bigger. Coordinated carrier movements, unusual supply requests, a term repeated with insistence, AF. AF, a place, a target. But the Japanese had masked it well. Washington dismissed early warnings as overinterpretation, yet Ellery saw the shift clearly, like a dark tide rolling under the surface of routine messages. Japan still believed America was reeling from humiliation, Wake Island, the Philippines, the burning hulls at Pearl Harbor. They thought the U.S. Navy was limping, half-blind, unprepared. But Ellery felt the storm forming. The enemy was planning something decisive, something vast enough to snap the Pacific in half. He wiped sweat from his brow, listening to the slow tick of the wall clock and the distant crash of waves beyond the harbor. The room seemed to tighten around him, as if time itself held its breath. And then it struck, a coded supply request referencing aircraft fuel reserves far beyond normal sortie needs. Ellery froze. His pencil dropped. They were preparing for a major carrier strike, and AF, whatever it truly was, sat at the center of it. He pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping across the concrete floor, heart pounding with a dreadful certainty. If he was right, the Japanese were about to strike a blow meant to finish what they started at Pearl Harbor. Only the code in this room, only the fragile stream of intercepted whispers could stop a disaster. Ellery exhaled slowly, knowing what this meant. The storm was coming, and he was the first American to see its shadow moving toward Midway. But Washington still did not believe him, and that would force Ellery into a desperate gamble that could expose the truth or condemn the Pacific to ruin. The morning heat pressed against the windows of the intelligence center like a slow hand as Lieutenant Mark Ellery stood over the long wooden table in the operations room, the residue of sleepless nights still etched across his face. He watched a group of officers debate in hushed, irritated tones, unconvinced. AF was still a phantom in their eyes, a mirage produced by overworked cryptologists desperate to find meaning where none existed. Ellery felt the sting of doubt, not in himself, but in the commanders who refused to see the storm forming beyond the horizon. The tension between analysts and Washington had grown like a fracture in steel. Too many senior officers still clung to the belief that the Japanese were reeling from Coral Sea, that they lacked the strength for a major operation. But Ellery felt the Japanese buildup in every intercepted whisper, the subtle increase in radio discipline, the coordinated silence among carrier groups, the eerie way certain frequencies went dead at the same time every night. Silence itself had become a message, a dangerous one. That morning, as ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, Commander Joseph Rochefort entered the room with the quiet calm of a man carrying dynamite in his thoughts. He motioned Ellery closer. "We're running out of time," he murmured. "If we can't prove AF is Midway, Washington will ignore this entire threat." Ellery nodded. He already knew the stakes. And yet, the idea Rochefort presented felt like stepping onto a tightrope stretched across the Pacific. They would send a fake, unsecured message from Midway, an open radio broadcast claiming the island's fresh water system had failed. If the Japanese intercepted it and repeated the information in their encrypted traffic, then AF would finally have a name. Hours later, the message was transmitted into the ocean air, drifting like bait into the enemy's net. Then came the waiting. Long, suffocating hours filled with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the restless scratching of pencils on paper. Every man in the room leaned closer to the headphones, listening for Japanese signals that might never come. Ellery sat at his desk, shoulders rigid, eyes burning from fatigue. The basement felt colder now, as if the world above had retreated, and all that remained was this underground chamber where the fate of the Pacific balanced on static. The operators rotated in shifts, their faces pale under the lamps, their hands trembling from anticipation. Then, at 0946, a burst of Japanese encrypted transmission cut through the room. The operator jolted upright. Ellery rushed to his side, heart hammering. A decoded fragment appeared on the notepad. AF is short of water. The room fell silent, as if every machine had stopped breathing. Ellery stared at the words, a cold shiver crawling up his spine. The confirmation was absolute. Midway was the target. They had caught the enemy speaking without realizing it. For the first time since the war began, the Americans had outpaced the Japanese. They had stepped into the enemy's shadow without being seen. Ellery looked around at the stunned faces in the room. The officers who had doubted him now stood frozen, their disbelief melting into something colder. The realization that a massive Japanese strike force was already on its way. Outside, the Hawaiian wind carried the scent of salt and rain. The Pacific seemed deceptively calm, but Ellery knew the signal they had intercepted was not just information, it was a countdown. The trap was set, but now the broken American fleet would have to race against time to meet the enemy before the hammer fell. The sun was sinking behind the dry hills of Oahu when Commander Nathan Briggs stepped onto the scaffolding that surrounded the battered hull of USS Yorktown. The air smelled of welding sparks, burnt paint, and the sweat of thousands of men fighting the clock. The carrier lay wounded after Coral Sea, her decks torn open, her bulkheads twisted, her engines groaning like an old animal. She should have spent 3 months in a dry dock. Admiral Nimitz had given her 72 hours. Briggs, a logistics officer with sharp features and a voice roughened by years at sea, felt the weight of that impossible order pressing on his shoulders. He moved through the controlled chaos on deck, sparks raining like yellow fireflies, cranes lifting replacement steel plates, sailors hauling cables, machinists shouting above the growl of generators. The whole scene looked less like a repair yard and more like a battlefield where the enemy was time itself. He paused near the forward elevator, watching men crawl through the exposed framework. Their hands were raw, their faces smeared with grease, but none slowed. Every clang of a hammer, every hiss of a torch carried the same message. Midway depended on them. Briggs asked Chief Engineer Lawson, a burly man whose beard was flecked with metal dust. "We'll get her ready," Lawson muttered without looking up, his voice vibrating with exhaustion and certainty, "even if it kills us." Briggs nodded silently. He knew they all believed the same thing, that the Japanese fleet, larger and more experienced, was already on the move. If Yorktown stayed in port, if the U.S. Navy sailed with only 2 operational carriers, the battle would be lost before it began. Midway, the small atoll in the middle of an endless ocean, had become a hinge on which history would turn. Night fell, but the repair docks blazed with floodlights. Men worked in 12-hour shifts without complaint. Welders' arcs lit the carrier's massive hull like lightning. Steam rose from hot plates doused with seawater. The air shuddered with the pounding of rivets. A doctor passed through the deck treating burns and cuts, but the workers refused to stop. Every minute mattered. Every minute lost brought the enemy closer. Briggs moved below decks, where the corridors echoed with hurried footsteps and muffled hammering. He checked supply manifests, fuel reserves, and ammunition stockpiles, and the status of half-installed radio equipment. The ship felt alive again, breathing, straining, pushing against its own brokenness. So many systems were being rebuilt simultaneously that the carrier resembled a living maze of flickering cables and open bulkheads. The hours blurred. Days became a continuous stream of noise and heat, of urgency so intense it felt like a physical force. Briggs barely slept. He remained on deck as dawn broke on the 3rd day, watching exhausted men wipe their faces with trembling hands. They had done the impossible. Yorktown was patched. Not perfect, not truly restored, but seaworthy and armed. When the carrier pulled away from the dock, the workers on shore stood in silence, saluting the massive silhouette as it moved into open water. Briggs watched their faces fade behind a curtain of sea spray. He understood what they had given. Not just labor, hope. The fleet gathered, Enterprise, Hornet, and the wounded Yorktown. 3 American carriers sailing toward a trap set for an enemy that still believed the United States lay helpless. Briggs gripped the cold railing as the Pacific wind whipped across the deck. He could feel the engines thrum beneath his boots, carrying them toward a battle they were not expected to survive. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outtrained, but they were no longer blind. The American fleet was racing toward Midway, and the fate of the Pacific was riding with them on waves that grew darker with every mile. June 4th, 1942. The first light crept across the Pacific like the slow opening of an eyelid, revealing a horizon trembling with heat and danger. On the island of Midway, Lieutenant Samuel Reed stood on the sandbagged observation post, the sour smell of burned oil already drifting in from the sea. The air was warm, heavy, vibrating with tension. Every seabird that lifted off the lagoon seemed to sense what was coming. Reed pressed his binoculars to his eyes. He was a lean man in his late 20s, with a face carved by sleepless nights and wind-burned patrols. The distant sky to the northwest shimmered strangely, a thin formation of black dots growing larger with each second. Then the rising sun caught the glint of metal, and his breath locked in his chest. Here they come. His voice was flat, steady, almost too calm. Moments later, the scream of approaching engines tore the morning open. Japanese carrier planes, dozens upon dozens, descended like a dark swarm. Their shadows passed over the sand, long and sharp, cutting across bunkers and fuel tanks. Reed felt the shock wave of the first explosion slam into his chest, rattling the wooden beams above him. Flames shot skyward from the airfield as bombs fell in precise arcs. The ground shook. Men ran through choking smoke, their silhouettes flickering against burning hangars. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, their barrels glowing red, but the defenders were simply too few. Reed's ears rang with the shrill whistle of diving aircraft and the deep thud of detonations, swallowing chunks of earth. American fighters rose to meet them. The outdated, overworked wildcats, climbing stubbornly into an unequal battle. Reed watched one catch fire mid-climb, the pilot refusing to bail out, still trying to angle toward an enemy bomber, even as his wings burned. Seconds later, the aircraft spiraled into the sea. But Reed knew, with a cold clarity that tightened around his ribs, that this brutal assault wasn't the main event. This was the Japanese pounding the island into dust, clearing the way. The real battle was still miles away, hidden beyond the cobalt horizon, where two fleets groped for each other through empty air. A radio operator burst into the observation post, breathless. "Contact report incoming from PBY scout plane. Enemy carriers sighted, bearing 320. Reed turned sharply, the words striking him harder than any explosion outside. Carriers. The heart of the Japanese strike force. 4 of them, if the intelligence was right. On the American carriers far beyond the island, the news arrived with electric urgency. Commanders on the Enterprise and Hornet didn't hesitate. Orders rippled across their decks, launch everything that can fly. Deck crews raced to arm torpedoes and fuel dive bombers. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft, boots clanging on steel, faces streaked with sweat and adrenaline. Machines roared to life, coughing out blue exhaust. There was no time for coordination, no time for polished formations. Squadrons launched in fragments, torpedo planes veering one way, fighters another, dive bombers circling like confused swarms of hornets before heading west. Reed lowered his binoculars, seeing nothing on the far ocean except a faint, shimmering line where sky met water. But he felt the shift in the air, a tremor of destiny running through every gust of rising wind. Midway was burning. Men were dying. The island's guns were running hot and low on ammunition. Yet Reed sensed something had begun far greater than what lay before his eyes. The American strike groups, as scattered and disorganized as they were now racing toward the biggest gamble the Pacific had seen. Everything depended on whether those pilots could find the Japanese carriers in the vast emptiness of the ocean. And Reed, standing amid fire and smoke, felt the terrible certainty that the next hours would decide the fate of the war. The ocean below shimmered like hammered steel as Lieutenant Howard Kane gripped the controls of his SBD Dauntless, the engine's steady drone vibrating through his bones. He had been flying for hours over an empty, unforgiving blue, a pilot suspended between hope and fuel gauges sinking dangerously low. Sweat stung his eyes. His throat was dry. Every second that passed tightened the knot in his chest. Kane was a tall, sharp-featured man with the calm gaze of someone who had survived too many near misses to fear the next one openly. But fatigue clung to him like a second skin. His squadron had lost contact with the others after launch, scattered by confusion, faulty bearings, and the vast distances that swallowed radio signals whole. Now only 4 bombers remained on his wing, ghost-like shadows drifting over the waves. "If we don't find them soon, we're done," his rear gunner muttered through the intercom, voice thin with anxiety. Kane didn't respond. He knew the truth. The fuel indicator needle hovered near the bottom edge of the gauge, threatening to fall completely. If the Japanese carriers were not ahead, then the mission and every life in these cockpits was already over. He scanned the horizon again, eyes burning. Nothing. Just sun glare and endless ocean. Then something moved. A thin wake cutting against the wind, a lone destroyer racing at full speed. The ship's bow chopped the water with frantic urgency, as though chasing something invisible. Kane felt his pulse spike. "That's no patrol," he whispered. "She's running to catch up with the fleet." He banked his plane hard to the right. "Follow her," he ordered, his voice suddenly alive. "She'll lead us straight to them." Minutes dragged by like hours as the Dauntlesses pursued the destroyer's path. The ocean's shimmer thickened into haze. Then the haze opened. Kane inhaled sharply.
4 Japanese carriers materialized beneath the clouds, colossal giants spread across the sea in precise formation. Their decks were covered with rows of aircraft being refueled, rearmed, repositioned for a new strike on Midway. Fuel hoses snaked across planks, bombs glinted in the morning sun. Deck crews moved in frantic patterns, unaware of the dive bombers approaching high above them. Kane's fingers tightened around the stick until his knuckles blanched. This was it, the moment generations would remember. He pulled back gently, positioning for the dive. The universe felt suspended, held by a thin thread of silence. The engine's roar faded. The wind's howl softened. Even his heartbeat seemed to pause. Then he pushed the Dauntless into a steep dive. The sky tilted into a vertical wall of blue as the bomber plummeted toward the Japanese flagship Akagi. The wind screamed through the cockpit. The plane shook violently, rattling like it might tear apart. Kane aligned the crosshairs with a cluster of fuel trucks on the flight deck, sweat sliding down his jaw. Bomb release. The Dauntless jerked upward as Kane yanked the stick, the G-forces crushing his chest. Below him, a bright flash erupted, then another. Then the deck vanished under a rising column of fire. Explosions tore through the carrier, flames racing along the fused gasoline lines. At the same time, other Dauntlesses screamed down on Kaga and Soreu, releasing deadly arcs of steel. 3 carriers, 3 floating fortresses turned into infernos within 4 minutes. 4 minutes that shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. 4 minutes that unmade a battle plan. 4 minutes that rewrote the Pacific War. Kane leveled out, heart pounding, the sky behind him filled with smoke and rising pillars of fire. The fleet that had once thundered across oceans now lay drowning in flames and chaos. But he had no feeling of triumph, only survival, and the knowledge that there was still one more carrier out there, untouched, preparing to counterattack. The battle was far from over, and the final strike, Kane knew, would decide whether Midway became victory or disaster.
The thick stench of burning fuel drifted across the Pacific as Lieutenant Howard Kane circled his battered Dauntless above the smoking ruins of the Japanese fleet. The sky was bruised with rising pillars of black, each one marking the death cry of a carrier. Below him, the once mighty Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu writhed in fire, their decks buckling, their crews scrambling in desperate, disordered lines. The ocean roared around them, swallowing debris and men alike. Kane tightened his jaw. The explosions still echoed in his ears, vibrating through the metal frame of his aircraft. He looked toward the horizon, where the 4th carrier, Hiryu, had vanished earlier into a sheet of haze. She had escaped the morning inferno. And even now, Japanese pilots launched from her decks, striking back with a ferocity born of disbelief and wounded pride. On the Yorktown, Commander Nathan Briggs felt the deck shudder beneath his feet as enemy bombs crashed into the carrier's hull. The sky flashed white. Shards of metal rained across the flight deck. Men scrambled through smoke thick as fog, dragging hoses, sealing ruptured pipes, shouting orders hoarse from exhaustion. Yorktown trembled but refused to die, her crew patching her wounds in real time, fighting the ship's pain with their own burning lungs. Briggs tasted metal and smoke as he scanned the chaos around him. "Hold her steady," he yelled to the damage control teams. The Japanese attack waves hammered again and again, each strike born from the lone surviving carrier that clung to the fight with desperate resolve. But the Americans were no longer blind. High above, Kane's bomber group reformed, their formations ragged, fuel nearly gone, yet driven by a sense of inevitability. "We finish this," Kane muttered, turning his Dauntless toward the distant glimmer where Hiryu cut across the sea like a wounded predator. Hours later, the last American dive bombers fell upon her. Kane watched from above as the final carrier erupted into sheets of orange flame, her flight deck split open like cracked stone. Men leapt into the water, others clung to burning fragments. the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the heart of its striking power, was dying in silence, broken only by the hiss of burning metal into the sea. By dusk, the ocean was calm again, though littered with the ghosts of battle. Smoke drifted like mourning veils across the waves. Kane landed his Dauntless on the Enterprise, wheels skidding across the deck, his hands trembling as the aircraft rolled to a stop. When he stepped out, the wind carried the faint sound of distant explosions still simmering from ships swallowed by fire. That night, in the dim corridors illuminated by flickering bulbs, intelligence officers spread casualty lists across a table. Names filled the pages. American pilots who never returned, crews lost aboard flaming vessels, men who vanished into a sea that kept its secrets. Kane stood behind them, silent. He recognized many names. Others he had only seen briefly, faces lit by sunrise before they soared into a sky they would never come back from. He felt no triumph, only a heavy stillness, the kind that came after a storm, when the world struggled to understand the magnitude of what had been torn apart. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, the Japanese Naval General Staff struggled to comprehend the catastrophe. Reports arrived confused, fragmented, carrying the voices of stunned survivors. 4 carriers gone, hundreds of elite pilots lost, irreplaceable men forged through years of training. The pride of the fleet shattered in a single day. The Empire's war plan, once bold and uncompromising, now stood on broken legs. Kane knew what this meant. The tide had turned. The momentum that had carried Japan across half the Pacific had halted, split open by a combination of intelligence, nerve, and the courage of men who refused to surrender the sky. He walked to the railing of the Enterprise and stared out across the dark sea. The wind carried the cold scent of ash. The silhouettes of distant warships drifted on the waves, their decks illuminated by small, flickering lights. Somewhere out there, the bodies of friends floated beneath the surface. And yet, in that quiet moment, Kane understood a truth far larger than himself. Midway had not been won by strength alone. It had been won by information, by the men in the basement who broke the code, by the sailors who rebuilt Yorktown with shattered hands, by the pilots who dove through fire with almost empty tanks. History had shifted because a handful of people chose to stand when collapse seemed inevitable. Kane closed his eyes as the wind brushed against his face. This was the turning of the Pacific. This was the day an empire broke. And from the blackened waters of Midway, a new future was beginning to rise.